All right, so we know plants are around about 470 million years ago on land because of the fossilized spores, which are found thanks to the molecule which resists desiccation, sporopollenin. We have lots of fossil evidence of the early plants. We have less or fewer fossils of the plants themselves, but we do have some that are not quite this old from the plants themselves. So this indicates that by this point, plants were on land producing spores, haploid spores. Remember, these are the haploid spores that are going to grow into gametophytes. And here's what those spores would have been released from. A sporangium is what spores are released from, and this particular fossil is a little bit younger than the fossils of the spores themselves. Let's just look at the variety of plants that exist today. Now, in this chapter, we're going to talk about the nonvascular plants, liverworts and mosses mostly, and then also ferns, and a little bit of lycophytes. The seedless vascular plants. And then in chapter 30, we're going to talk about gymnosperms and angiosperms, which totally dominate plants today. And if we look here at these more primitive plants, the seedless vascular plants and the non-vascular plants, mosses have the most species, and then liverworts, with you can see hornworts are quite rare. It's only 100 species. And the seedless vascular plants like ferns and the Lycophyta. Ferns are much more common, but they are totally dwarfed. If we look down here at the flowering plants, the angiosperms, most of the species of plants alive today are angiosperms. And so we're going to talk about angiosperms specifically in the next chapter. And they evolved approximately in this order, with the non-vascular plants first, and then the seedless vascular plants, which came to dominate the land plants. The seedless vascular plants totally dominated the early plant life on Earth. Then the gymnosperms came to be the dominant plants. And during the age of the dinosaurs, it was seedless vascular plants and gymnosperms were the dominant plants. And then the flowering plants showed up, and they outcompeted everything. And now our forests are totally dominated by flowering plants, the angiosperms. And in fact, almost all of our crop plants are angiosperms as well. But we'll talk about those in the next chapter. So let's look at plants here again. So here's our little phylogenetic tree. So back here is our ancestral charophyte that evolved into the first land plants, and we have liverworts as the first branch here that still exists. Now there are branches here that were earlier branches that are extinct now. There's no plants left in that particular group, but we're not going to talk about those. So liverworts, mosses, and hornworts are still around, and they represent early branches. They are ancient plants that have been around almost since the beginning of plants. Then we have the seedless but vascular plants like ferns and club mosses. These dominated later. So during the first half of the age of the dinosaurs, these were the plants that dominated the forests of Earth. Then later, gymnosperms and angiosperms. First gymnosperms, then angiosperms, and now angiosperms totally dominate. Since the late age of the dinosaurs, right before the dinosaurs went extinct, angiosperms were already dominant by that point. So, but we'll talk about these two groups, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, in the next chapter. So mosses are non-vascular. So what does that mean? That means that they can't transport water through their tissues in vessels. So like think of what the word vascular means in terms of human biology. If you're going to need a vascular surgeon to work on you, that means they're going to be operating on some sort of blood vessels, maybe in your heart. Vascular has something to do with your blood vessels. In plants, the vascular tissue transports water and nutrients, and it's not pumped around. It moves around in other ways. So the plants that are non-vascular, that means that water got around inside of their plant bodies just by diffusion. They didn't have vessels to transport water around or other nutrients. So that means they're small. So the non-vascular plants today and in the past were pretty small. They were not large because they couldn't transport water very far from the ground. And that's still true today. So this is some nice bryophyte down here, mosses. Hornworts are weird. I'll show you a picture of hornworts, but even if you saw hornworts, they're pretty small. Even if you saw hornworts, you'd have to really know what you were looking for to realize that they were hornworts. Mosses are the most likely one of these that you've seen. If you've seen the green stuff growing between the bricks in a sidewalk or something, that's moss. Liverworts, you probably wouldn't see them unless you went to a very, very wet forested area. So bryophytes have gametophytes that are either male or female. Let's look at the life cycle here. Let's start with the gametophyte portion of the life cycle. So the gametophytes are either male or female. They're haploid. The gametophytes make gametes. So the male gametophyte produces sperm in the antheridia, which require water for fertilization to occur, which is again why we tend to find mosses and well, especially liverworts also in wet environments because they have sperm with flagella that swim and need water. Female gametophyte makes the eggs. They're produced in the archegonia, only one egg in an archegonia. Sperm make it in there. They can swim even with just a coating of water. They don't need a huge amount of water. And now we have a zygote that's diploid. That's going to start to divide and form an embryo. The embryo is going to grow inside of the female gametophyte and be dependent upon the female gametophyte. Now in mosses and liverworts, that sporophyte is always dependent on the gametophyte. It's never going to be an independent plant. But as we'll see with ferns, that's a little bit different. So the gametophyte is dominant. The green plant that you see is dominant. The photosynthetic part of the plant is gametophyte. The sporophyte just has one purpose, and that's meiosis and producing new haploid spores to grow into the next generation. So the sporophytes are very small. Sporophytes never live independently of the gametophyte. They're very tiny. So here's a liverwort. Now here we can see female liverwort. Down here you can see the thallus. There are these little cups here too. That's for asexual reproduction. And the little female structures here of the female gametophyte. And then here's a close-up of what that little sporophyte looks like. They eventually look like little yellow capsules. They're completely dependent, though, on the gametophyte. So gametophyte is dominant. Hornworts in that same group, these are pretty rare. There aren't very many species of these. They live in wet environments. And the gametophyte is this small, kind of leafy looking structure. And then the sporophyte is this spiky looking thing. And you can see why they're called hornworts. Wort, this W-O-R-T, that's an old English word that means plant. So liverworts and hornworts, these are old words in English. That's why they have that weird word wort in there. Mosses, it's a nice moss. Mosses are the most diverse. There are mosses that, despite the fact that they have flagellated sperm that need water for fertilization, there are many species of mosses that can tolerate kind of extreme environments with poor soil, dry conditions, harsh winters, which is why they're fairly abundant, even though they're so small and they don't have any vascular tissue or true roots. One of the more important mosses is peat moss. You might have heard of peat moss. Sometimes people buy it to fertilize their gardens with. Peat bogs are acidic. Most plants cannot grow in a peat bog. Peat moss, though, is very well adapted to that, and peat bogs are extremely important if you're concerned about global warming. The amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is one of the primary drivers of global warming. We want to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Peat bogs are a great carbon dioxide sink. That means that the photosynthesis of the peat moss captures CO2 and turns it into plant material like cellulose. And then because the bog is acidic, the dead moss just sinks and it doesn't decompose. So peat bogs sequester CO2 and remove it from the atmosphere. Ferns and seedless plants that had vascular tissue were the first tall plants. Non-vascular plants cannot grow tall. They don't have a way to move water around in a large organism. But ferns and their relatives are vascular. They have tubes inside of the stems that allow water to be transported around. So these plants were created the first forests and were the first really tall plants. Here's a tree fern right here. Tree ferns are quite rare today, although they were very common during the early part of the age of the dinosaurs in the late Permian. Tree ferns and and club moss trees were very common. They've been outcompeted, though, by angiosperm trees. And now you can only find them in a few protected locations. There's several islands in the Caribbean where there are still tree ferns. There's a few islands in the Pacific, like New Caledonia, that have tree ferns. But mostly, almost everywhere on land, they have gone extinct as they've been outcompeted by flowering plants. So the early vascular plants had sporophytes as the dominant form. So in our non-vascular plants, the green growing plant that you see is the gametophyte. For vascular plants, the sporophyte became dominant. So for ferns and club mosses, the plant that you see, the green growing plant, that's now the sporophyte. So this was a trend within the plants. The gametophyte gets smaller and smaller. The sporophyte became larger and larger in the more dominant form. They have vascular tissue, and now we have the first true roots and leaves. Because roots and leaves are vascular, so the non-vascular plants cannot have true roots and leaves. So here's a little bit more detail for the fern life cycle. So we still have alternation of generations. We have a diploid sporophyte and a haploid gametophyte. The sporophyte is the dominant one, so this is the one that you see. When you see a fern, you're looking at the sporophyte. Those little brown dots on the back of a fern leaf, those are the sporangia. That's where meiosis occurs, and haploid spores are going to be released from those sporangia. Now they're tiny spores, like a grain of dust. They land in the soil, and if they get wet enough, they will start to divide, and they will form a gametophyte. Now the gametophytes are very small. We're going to see some in lab. We have slides of some. The gametophytes are really small, and they can produce both types of gametes. So the gametophyte produces both eggs and sperm. But we still call the structures that produce the sperm antheridia, and the structures that produce the egg archegonia. Archegonia would be the plural, archegonium would be singular. And that haploid egg will be fertilized by a haploid sperm, and then we have our zygote. The zygote starts to grow into an embryo. The embryo is initially completely dependent on its gametophyte parent for nutrition, but eventually, because now the sporophyte is the dominant generation, the sporophyte gets larger and larger and eventually doesn't need the gametophyte anymore, and the gametophyte shrivels up and disappears. And then we end up with our large, mature sporophyte as the dominant generation. So It's still an embryophyte, because you remember the definition of all plants are embryophytes. An embryophyte means that the embryo is dependent on its parent. And in this case, we have our female, our tiny little female, or our little gametophyte. That's where the embryo is going to grow. So the vascular tissue, which we'll talk more about in a later chapter, it's called xylem and phloem. The xylem conducts the water and minerals. The phloem conducts sugars and amino acids and other organic molecules dissolved in water. And why does there need to be two different tubes? Because they're going in different directions. Water is coming up from the roots and going to the leaves, and sugar is manufactured in the leaves. It's going down to the roots. Roots as vascular plants innovated with true roots that can transport water. This was a big evolutionary advantage because plants that have true roots, now the non-vascular plants have root-like rhizomes, but they can't absorb water and transport it to the rest of the plant. True roots allowed plants to inhabit drier environments because they could send their roots down into the soil and obtain water that was not available to plants that only have little rhizomes right under the surface, like liverworts. So plants could progressively inhabit drier and drier environments. Leaves are also a vascular tissue, so a plant that's non-vascular does not have true leaves. Leaves, by definition, have vascular tissue in them. And we divide leaves into two groups, whether they're simple and only have a single single vascular tissue, that's a microphyll, or if they have branched vascular tissue, that's a megaphyll. Mega means big, micro means small. You probably can guess that. And within the non-seed vascular plants, the most primitive vascular plants, we find both types of leaves. Ferns are what we call homosporous, meaning that the spores that are produced, so here we see the root homo meaning the same, like in homozygous, and spore, so all the spores are the same. That's what that means. Homosporous means all the spores are the same. And those spores grow into a gametophyte that can produce both eggs and sperm. For the seed plants, which is what we're going to talk about in the next chapter, the gymnosperms and angiosperms, they're heterosporous. So that means hetero means other or different. So heterosporous means they produce different types of spores. So the spores are either going to form a female gametophyte or a male gametophyte, and we call them megaspores and microspores. Mega means big, so big spores make the female gametophyte, little spores make the male gametophyte. So here's our seedless vascular plants other than the ferns. The Lycophyta, and there are not a lot of extant species of the Lycophyta. You've probably never seen them. You might have seen a spike moss in a plant arrangement. That's the only place I've ever seen them. Quillworts are pretty rare. There's not very many species of these. You can kind of see why they're called quillworts. Their leaves kind of look like the pin feathers that grow in on birds, which is what quill originally means. And then club mosses, they're not in the same group as the other mosses that we were looking at because they are vascular. And their sporangia kind of look like clubs, so that's why they're called club mosses. These are pretty rare too and weird. All these are weird. Ferns belong to the manilophytes, and we have ferns here. Ferns are, as I showed you before, of these more primitive plants, they're one of the more common groups, mosses and ferns. And whisk ferns are pretty rare and odd. If you saw a whisk fern, you would think, what is that? It looks weird. It doesn't look like a plant. It looks like green sticks. Horsetails are still pretty common, especially in the Midwest where I am. There are, in the prairie ecosystem, there are a lot of horsetails. Pioneers actually called it the pot scrubber plant. They used it. It's got silica in it, and I'm going to try to bring some into lab. They feel very hard and unplant-like. because of the silica in there. Many species of this are extinct. There's not very many species left of the horsetails. So seedless vascular plants, that's what we finished talking about here, the ferns and the lycophytes. They were extremely dominant in the early part of the age of the dinosaurs, and before that, before the dinosaurs evolved, the age of reptiles. They didn't decay completely, those forests, those carboniferous forests, and that led to these fern trees and all these other huge club mosses and everything ended up being buried without completely decomposing, and that formed the fossil fuels like coal that we're still mining today. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about the seeded plants, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Gymnosperm means naked seed, and angiosperms are all of the flowering plants, which are now totally the dominant plant. If you go outside and try to find a plant that's not an angiosperm, it's probably a gymnosperm. And then if you try to find a plant that's neither one of those, probably the only thing you're going to find is maybe a moss or a fern. Angiosperms totally dominate plant life today. And we'll talk about those in the next chapter.